Deep in the Kentucky mountains, an old wedding photograph lies hidden in a forgotten chest. At first glance, it looks ordinary. A young groom dressed in dark suit, standing proudly beside another groom. Their posture seems steady, their expressions calm, almost hopeful. But stare a little longer, and the image twists into something deeply unsettling. This was no ordinary union. It wasn't a joining of distant households. It was blood uniting with blood. The groom had not married into another clan. He had married his own brother. What followed was not love nor freedom, but a legacy of suffering, secrecy, and deliberate self-destruction. A bloodline that chose to consume itself, generation after generation, until only graves remained to tell the story. If this hidden history shocks you already, wait until you hear the rest. Hit like, subscribe, and share this with someone who enjoys uncovering America's darkest forgotten secrets. It helps more than you know. In a forgotten attic, tucked behind crumbling walls and rusted tools, lay a wedding photograph few dared to mention. Two grooms stood side by side, their posture upright, their gazes locked in unsettling silence. The image, yellowed by time, showed what outsiders assumed were distant cousins beginning life together. Yet the truth was far darker. These grooms were not strangers. They were brothers bound by blood, united by disturbing tradition. The suit jackets looked neat, collars pressed, but beneath the fabric lingered generations of secrecy. This was not celebration. This was calculated obedience to an ancestor's command that brothers must never marry outside their line. Historians who uncovered the photograph felt a cold weight pressing upon them. It was not mere curiosity. It was dread, the realization that these men were part of something designed to destroy itself deliberately. In 1920s Kentucky, neighbors who might have noticed chose silence. The hills bred isolation, and isolation bred secrets. Brothers could wed brothers, and outsiders would never intervene, never even hear whispers of forbidden rituals. The photograph alone would have been haunting, but it was only the doorway. Behind it stretched a bloodline twisted into knots of loyalty, cruelty, and obsession. Each generation of men carried scars older than themselves. The groom on the left was Samuel Bramwell. The groom on the right was Thomas Bramwell. They had grown together, hunted together, fought together, yet were told since birth their lives belonged only to each other. No outsider could comprehend the silence surrounding them. Their fathers and uncles enforced the tradition with stern faces and sharp words. To question the command was betrayal, a dishonor against generations buried beneath the soil. Imagine being raised never to dream of love outside your brother's shadow. Imagine being told that purity came not from faith or strength, but from keeping your bloodline locked, tighter and tighter, every passing year. The Bramwell attic contained more than this photograph. Records scrawled in brittle ink detailed unions of brother with brother, son promised to cousin, uncle joined with nephew. Each page revealed calculations dressed as destiny, cruelty masked as duty. Samuel's eyes in the picture carried a strange hollowness, as though emotion had been removed from him long ago. Thomas's hand rested stiffly on his brother's shoulder, not affectionate, but weighty, as if bound by chains. The preacher who officiated never questioned their identical names or sharp resemblance. A generous payment kept his voice steady, his questions buried. The ceremony lasted minutes, but its consequences stretched into decades of suffering. The brothers' union was not born from desire. It was the direct result of their grandfather's obsession, an idea that strength was preserved only by collapsing bloodlines inward, generation upon generation, until escape became impossible. Outside, mountains towered silently. Inside, the Bramwell house echoed with rehearsed words, sons forced into roles designed before their births. Each brother was not truly free, each was part of a breeding experiment cloaked as tradition. Those who eventually discovered the truth could not decide what was more terrifying, the photograph itself or the acceptance surrounding it. No one resisted, No uncle, no father, no brother dared to stand against it. This chapter in history is not just about one union. It is about a long line of men, raised to obey, raised to continue something they could not escape, until graves became the only rebellion. The attic photograph remains a relic, proof that some of America's darkest secrets did not hide in distant lands, but in its own backwoods. Secrets sealed not by distance, but by silence, enforced brother to brother. What began as a single unsettling image will unravel into the full chronicle of a bloodline deliberately destroyed from within. And it all starts with two brothers who never had the chance to choose otherwise. The Bramwell curse did not begin with Samuel or Thomas. Its roots stretched back to 1847, when Jeremiah Bramwell, a man already burdened by whispers of disgrace, left Virginia and carved out life in Kentucky's hidden hollows. Jeremiah's departure was not driven by law or fortune. It was something darker. Court whispers spoke of his closeness to his younger brother Elias, a bond considered unnatural, unacceptable, and threatening to the fragile order of his community. When questions became too sharp, Jeremiah left. The mountains gave him distance, and distance gave him freedom. Here, no neighbor would pry, no preacher would press, and no outsider would question why two brothers lived as one. In Pike County, Jeremiah's story transformed. To strangers, he became simply a settler seeking solitude. To his kin, he became a patriarch with a twisted vision, that bloodlines must remain pure by binding brothers together forever. Jeremiah believed outsiders weakened the line. Strangers, he argued, carried flaws, distractions, and temptations. Purity came from within. Purity meant brothers marrying brothers, fathers promising sons to cousins, uncles binding nephews, each generation tightening the knot further. Elias soon joined Jeremiah in Kentucky, carrying Jeremiah's child in secret before papers were forged to conceal their truth. The preacher who blessed their union ignored mirrored features, ignoring the truth beneath coin and silence. Thus began the Bramwell line's first deliberate merging of brothers. The union was not whispered shame, but foundation stone. Jeremiah declared his house blessed, chosen by heaven to remain undiluted, regardless of the suffering it created. Their firstborn son, Ezekiel, arrived the following year. Strong at birth, yet by 3, his arm withered, his speech broken, his gaze unsettling. Jeremiah, however, saw not weakness, but the first mark of divine concentration. Ezekiel was told from infancy that he was chosen. Jeremiah taught him the creed: strength through closeness, loyalty through union, and destiny through bloodline purity. Ezekiel grew knowing his future belonged not to himself, but to his brother. By 1870, Ezekiel was paired with his younger brother Charity, as predetermined since childhood. The bond was not affection, but decree. Brothers became husbands, duty replacing desire, tradition replacing choice, obedience replacing human longing. The wedding was small, held inside their cabin, attended by uncles and cousins who had learned not to ask questions. Behind stern faces, silence reigned. No one dared admit what the vows truly meant. Charity already carried Ezekiel's child when they wed, a fact unspoken but undeniable. The birth would yield triplets, each one bearing evidence of what Jeremiah's obsession had set in motion, each one a testament to corruption. The first son, Samuel, appeared strong, but his legs failed him, leaving him crawling across cabin floors like an animal. The second, Ruth, was born malformed, his chest twisted, his heart exposed and fragile. The third son, Morai, bore intelligence sharper than any before him. He could read by 3, calculate by 5, and by 10, he spoke of perfecting blood through selective brotherhood, sounding reasonable yet monstrous underneath. Morai inherited more than intellect. He inherited coldness, a lack of compassion for weaker brothers. To him, those who died were failures, data points, errors in a grand experiment. unworthy of recognition or mourning. By 1895, Morai had risen as patriarch. He married his brother Temperance, producing sons both frail and strong. He kept meticulous ledgers of births, deformities, deaths, reducing his kin to numbers in his ruthless archive. The Bramwell bloodline became his experiment, a living laboratory hidden in Kentucky hills. Each marriage was arranged between brothers, each child a calculation, each death dismissed as acceptable cost in the pursuit of bloodline perfection. Thus, the seed Jeremiah planted grew into a tree gnarled with suffering. What began as exile for whispered shame evolved into a dynasty of deliberate self-destruction, all in the name of purity and brotherhood. The Bramwell Creed was not suggestion but command. Every son was raised to know his future belonged to a brother. Every uncle reinforced it, every father demanded it, every grandfather declared it holy. From earliest childhood, sons were reminded of their roles. No boy grew imagining love beyond his bloodline. Affection outside the house was betrayal, and betrayal carried consequences heavier than death, dishonor to all brothers. By the late 1800s, Morai Bramwell's household ruled with severity. He watched his sons as though they were livestock, calculating which brother would join with which, who would carry the next wave of this cruel inheritance. Thomas, born strong, was destined for marriage. His cousin Ezekiel whispered constantly that greatness lay in obedience. To Thomas, duty meant little choice. From birth, his path led only toward his closest brother. Morai reinforced this destiny with books, charts, and sermons. He spoke of concentrated strength, telling sons that bloodline closeness produced gifts. What others saw as deformity or madness, Morai explained as evolution wrapped in sacrifice. Sons sat cross-legged on wooden floors, listening to his lectures. He described fallen brothers not as tragedies, but as errors improving future unions. Their suffering became lessons, and their deaths became numbers in his ledgers. When Thomas turned 18, his uncle placed a hand on his shoulder and declared, "You will stand beside your brother. That is your honor." Thomas nodded, not from love, but from conditioned silence. The ceremony itself held no celebration. Brothers filled the cabin, standing in rigid rows, repeating oaths drilled into them since youth. No laughter broke the silence, only stern voices repeating vows etched in command. Outside, storms gathered over the ridges. Inside, firelight flickered on stern faces. Fathers watched sons, uncles watched nephews, and each man measured the weight of bloodline purity like iron shackles pressing against his chest. The union was brief. No outsider dared intrude. A preacher stood, reciting words while glancing nervously at identical names in his book. A purse of coins silenced his doubts, his trembling hands signing forbidden papers. Thomas did not smile. His brother did not either. They looked upon each other not as companions, but as necessary sacrifices to a code etched into their bones by grandfathers long buried. Other brothers soon followed. Each household in the Bramwell compound repeated the cycle. Sons were bound to cousins, nephews bound to uncles. The weight of command allowed no escape, no opportunity for rebellion. At night, Thomas dreamed of wide valleys beyond the mountains. Yet every morning, his grandfather's voice reminded him freedom was illusion, purity was truth, and brothers must bind brothers to protect their sacred destiny. Stories spread through neighboring hills, whispered between hunters and farmers. Outsiders wondered why Bramwell men never took brides from other clans. Questions rose, but gold, silence, and fear ensured no voice dared press harder. Inside the compound, the silence grew unbearable. Sons who hesitated were beaten. Uncles who questioned tradition were cast out. Each man learned early. Loyalty was survival, and survival required obedience without hesitation. For Thomas, the duty was suffocating. Yet to resist meant exile, and exile meant death in the unforgiving mountains. Better to remain chained inside bloodlines than vanish nameless in the wilderness beyond. Thus, the cycle tightened. Every generation of sons became both prisoner and jailer. Each brother bound another, each uncle prepared the next. And no one yet had courage to break the chains. The story of brothers bound by duty is not merely history, it is the slow crushing of human will beneath tradition's weight, where men became instruments, and freedom was buried beneath stone and silence. By the turn of the century, one man stood above all others in the Bramwell compound. Moray Bramwell, brilliant yet ruthless, transformed tradition into something far colder, a calculated study dressed as science. Unlike his father, who preached purity with passion, Moray approached it with records and measurements. He filled ledgers with columns of names, births, deaths, deformities, and strengths. His compound became not home, but laboratory. Brothers who limped, stuttered, or died young were labeled errors. Those who displayed strength, memory, or resilience were marked as gifts. Moray reduced blood and suffering into statistics, building his empire of shadows on ink. When questioned by uncles, he spoke calmly, like a teacher. He explained survival demanded sacrifice. For every brother broken, another would rise perfected. To him, tragedy was data, not grief. Cold arithmetic replaced compassion. Sons listened as though hearing prophecy. They were told they were chosen, sharpened through suffering. If they doubted, Moray reminded them that outsiders were weak, tainted, destined to vanish, while Bramwell's ascended through closeness. Moray married his own brother, Temperance, declaring it the highest form of obedience. Their sons filled the compound, many dying before manhood. Moray barely blinked, recording each corpse as though tallying fallen soldiers. Those who survived carried the full weight of his vision. Thomas, one of the stronger sons, grew broad-shouldered, but empty-eyed. He was praised not for humanity, but for durability, a living tool for lineage. Samuel, younger but sharper, absorbed Moray's teachings like scripture. His memory stretched back to infancy, his predictions uncanny. Moray adored him, calling him proof of concentrated greatness, a miracle born from decades of sacrifice. But behind Samuel's intelligence lingered something unsettling. His gaze was distant, his words detached. He spoke of brothers as components, breeding partners, and data points. Compassion had been bled out of him, replaced with calculation. The compound itself became shrine and prison. Long halls echoed with numbers, not laughter. Wooden tables bore ledgers, not meals. Brothers were summoned not for bonding, but for pairing, their futures etched by Moray's pen. Outsiders occasionally passed through, traders bringing supplies. They sensed something unnatural in the silence, the mirrored faces, the rigid discipline. But silver coins and stern glares ensured no man lingered long enough to question. By 1900, Moray's reputation spread beyond the hills. Local men whispered of a scholar living like a hermit, shaping his sons into something unnatural. Few dared approach, yet rumors of brilliance and cruelty multiplied. Thomas and Samuel, now grown, were regarded as Moray's finest work. One carried physical strength, the other mental acuity. Together, they represented the experiment's crown, brothers sculpted by bloodline obsession into tools of his vision. Yet cracks appeared. Sons buried too often, graves lined too closely, whispered doubts stirring among uncles. Some questioned whether the cost outweighed the dream. Moray silenced them with cold stares and reminders of obedience. His philosophy spread like contagion. Sons believed death was destiny, suffering was refinement, survival was proof of superiority. To outsiders, it was madness. To those inside, it was creed, etched deeper than marrow. By candlelight, Moray would write, "Each generation sharpens the next. Through pain, strength emerges. Through loss, greatness crystallizes. His words became scripture, read aloud by sons who dared not challenge the shadow of his authority. Thus the Bramwell compound entered its darkest chapter, no longer merely tradition, but deliberate experimentation, and at its center stood Morai, the scholar of shadows, shaping his brothers and sons into instruments of his obsession. The year 1921 arrived with strange warmth in the Kentucky hills, and within the Bramwell compound a wedding loomed. But this union carried no joy. It was obligation, a binding of brothers by command. Thomas stood as eldest, broad and silent. Samuel, 2 years younger, bore sharp intellect but little warmth. From infancy they had been told their destinies, not freedom, not love, but marriage to each other. The ceremony was arranged by Morai himself, his eyes alight with triumph. To him, this was culmination, the greatest experiment yet. To Thomas and Samuel, it was a chain disguised as ritual. Preparations filled the compound with forced excitement. Uncles whispered of purity, fathers spoke of honor, and grandfathers recalled traditions stretching back to Jeremiah. Yet behind their words lay unease, a quiet dread no man voiced. On the morning of the wedding, Thomas sat in his childhood room, staring at cracked wooden walls. He heard Samuel's footsteps nearby, steady, deliberate, as though rehearsed for the role forced upon them. The gathering was small. Only brothers, uncles, and fathers stood as witnesses. Their faces bore no smiles. Their eyes reflected duty, silence, and fear. This was not celebration. It was continuation of a curse. A preacher arrived, paid heavily for silence. He read vows while avoiding the groom's identical names, his trembling voice breaking on sacred phrases. His hands shook, but the weight of gold steadied his tongue. Thomas placed a hand upon Samuel's shoulder. The gesture, captured in a photograph, looked like brotherly pride. Yet beneath the touch lingered emptiness, as if neither man could summon even the pretense of joy. When vows ended, the brothers stood bound, not by affection, but by decree. Every man in the room knew what had occurred, yet none dared speak. To question meant exile, and exile meant ruin. That night, silence stretched heavy. Samuel, already conditioned by Morai's teachings, regarded the union as necessity, nothing more. Thomas, though stronger in body, felt hollow, as though some essential part of him had been stolen. The following weeks revealed the weight of the union. Morai monitored them with intensity, recording Samuel's observations, Thomas's behavior, every detail of their lives. To him, they were not men. They were data. When neighbors inquired about the wedding, Bramwell men lied easily. They spoke of distant cousins, fabricated stories, and claimed kin from other hills. Outsiders nodded politely, unwilling to pry into mountain shadows best left untouched. Inside the compound, Thomas and Samuel's marriage was celebrated as victory. Uncles toasted purity, fathers declared strength, and Morai wrote long entries in his ledgers, convinced this union would produce something extraordinary. But cracks formed early. Samuel's words grew colder, his eyes more detached. He spoke of offspring as experiments, not sons. Thomas recoiled, sensing the cruelty in his brother's tone, yet lacked courage to resist. The first child was born broken, his body fragile, his life short. Morai observed closely, calling the death useful data. Samuel echoed him while Thomas grieved silently, realizing their bond had birthed only suffering. Yet still the cycle continued. Another son, another grave. Each loss deepened Thomas's doubts, though Samuel remained unmoved. The ledger thickened with names, while the compound echoed with silence heavier than stone. The brothers' union was never love, never choice. It was tradition weaponized, science corrupted, faith distorted. And though it produced only pain, The Bramwell line marched forward, blind to the devastation it left behind. Thus, the wedding of Thomas and Samuel became legend in the compound, not for joy or prosperity, but as the darkest union yet, proof that brothers were shackled by duty more than blood. The union of Thomas and Samuel promised greatness in Morai's eyes. He believed their bloodline concentration would forge evolution itself. Instead, the sons born of that bond revealed horrors no patriarch could deny. The firstborn, Josiah, entered life broken, his spine twisted, skull misshapen, eyes clouded before they opened. He breathed shallow gasps, each one a struggle. For 6 weeks, brothers watched helplessly as he withered. Morai scribbled notes beside the crib, detailing every defect as though cataloging livestock. To him, Josiah was not a son, but an experiment gone wrong, a data point in his obsessive archive. Thomas sat beside the boy, holding a frail hand that never gripped back. He whispered songs taught by uncles, words that echoed against silence. Josiah died in his arms, a life measured only in suffering. Samuel, cold and detached, dismissed grief. He described Josiah's death as information. His voice carried no sorrow, only calculation. Thomas felt his brother's words like knives, realizing their bond had birthed only cruelty. Another son followed, living only 3 days. His chest never drew air steadily, his cries weak. When he died, Morai simply nodded, writing, "Failure, fragile structure." Samuel agreed, praising the lesson rather than mourning the loss. A third son arrived, surviving 2 months. Seizures tore through his small body, leaving him rigid, trembling. Thomas begged for help, but Morai silenced him. Observe, record, learn. The child died, buried nameless beneath frozen earth. By 1924, 4 sons had been born and buried. Graves dotted the hillside, each stone carrying the Bramwell name repeated endlessly. The compound grew quieter, as though even the wind refused to stir there. Thomas felt despair hardening into defiance. Each grave was a scar across his chest, each funeral a reminder that purity meant nothing but agony. He questioned whether obedience was worth so much death. Samuel disagreed. He clung tighter to Morai's teachings, convinced their sacrifices would yield greatness. He spoke of future sons, as if planning equations, blind to the corpses already rotting under their shared soil. Morai refused to see failure. He lectured that true strength emerged only through trial. For every dead son, he predicted one would live and thrive, carrying the concentrated gifts of the bloodline forward. The surviving brothers in the compound whispered uneasily. Some envied Thomas's grief, seeing in it a trace of humanity. Others feared Samuel's detachment, a reminder of what decades of indoctrination had carved into his soul. At night, Thomas walked among the graves. He traced carved names with calloused fingers, wondering if his sons had ever known comfort. Silence answered him, broken only by wind through skeletal branches overhead. The compound's younger sons grew restless. They saw funerals more often than feasts. They buried more brothers than they celebrated. Doubts stirred, but fear of exile kept their questions trapped inside hollow chests. Samuel grew colder still. He described offspring not as brothers but as attempts, trials, experiments. Thomas recoiled, but words failed him. His silence bound him tighter than chains, a prisoner of duty and fear. The graves became a monument to corruption. Each stone testified against Morai's vision, each mound of earth proof that purity was poison. Yet still, the cycle continued, driven by tradition older than any living man. The children of darkness never lived long enough to tell their story. Their voices were smothered by ideology, their suffering dismissed as progress. Only their father's grief carried their memory, echoing faintly against the hills. And so, the compound marched onward, blind to its own collapse, convinced sacrifice would lead to glory. But the earth itself remembered, holding the bodies of sons who had known only pain from birth. By 1925, the Bramwell compound stood hollow. Graves outnumbered sons, silence filled rooms once heavy with lectures, and Thomas felt chains loosening within his chest. For the first time, rebellion whispered against duty. Thomas had buried 4 sons. His hands still remembered the weight of their lifeless bodies. No creed, no ledger, no promise of purity could disguise the truth. His bloodline produced only pain. One winter night, he confided in an uncle. The older man, once silent, admitted he too carried doubts. For decades, he had watched sons die, brothers suffer, and still kept loyalty above conscience. The uncle's confession ignited something in Thomas. For years, he feared dishonor. Now he realized silence itself was betrayal. To remain loyal meant condemning unborn sons to the same torment already written in stone. Samuel noticed the shift. His brother spoke less of destiny, more of sorrow. He saw rebellion flicker in Thomas's eyes. Samuel responded with colder lectures, clinging harder to Marai's poisonous doctrine. Marai sensed resistance too. He shadowed Thomas, recorded his movements, demanded obedience. Yet cracks widened. No command could erase the graves. No speech could silence the echo of sons crying before death swallowed their voices. Thomas sought help beyond the compound. He visited Dr. Marcus Webb, a county physician, under pretense of illness. In hushed tones, he revealed fragments of the truth, enough to chill the doctor's blood. Dr. Webb pressed for more. Thomas hesitated, but the memory of tiny coffins drove him forward. He described decades of unions, brothers marrying brothers, sons born broken. The physician listened, horrified, struggling to absorb it. Word spread cautiously. Trusted men outside the compound began to whisper. At first, they dismissed the story as madness, but Webb's testimony and Thomas's haunted eyes carried weight that no outsider could easily deny. For the first time, Bramwell's secrecy cracked. Outsiders spoke of intervention. Officials muttered about investigations. Fear spread through the compound, not of outsiders, but of their own traditions finally being dragged into daylight. Samuel raged at Thomas. He accused him of treason, betrayal of generations. To Samuel, silence was loyalty, and loyalty was survival. He declared that no true Bramwell would expose his brother's sacred duty. Thomas answered with cold resolve. Our brothers are dead because of this. Our sons are buried because of this. What loyalty remains when loyalty demands graves? His words carried more power than fists ever could. The compound divided. Some sided with Samuel, clinging to tradition, unwilling to admit error. Others quietly supported Thomas, relieved someone had voiced doubts they had carried silently through endless funerals. For the first time, silence did not reign. Heated arguments echoed in cabins. Old men clutched ledgers like holy books, while younger men stared at graves, questioning whether purity was worth another generation's sacrifice. Morai tried to reassert control. He gave fiery speeches, waving records as proof of progress. But his voice cracked. His eyes betrayed fear. Even he could not deny the bodies piling beneath his command. Thomas refused to father another son. His declaration spread like wildfire. Younger brothers began whispering the same. The curse would not end with a single act, but the cycle had finally begun to weaken. Breaking the cycle was not dramatic escape, but quiet defiance. It was a man choosing silence no longer, choosing graves no more. And in that choice, the centuries-old foundation of Bramwell tradition began to crumble. When Morai finally died in 1928, the compound felt no relief. His body was buried alongside countless sons, his ledger clutched tightly, pages filled with calculations that had destroyed generations of brothers. Thomas outlived him by only a few years. Disease spread through his body, the same affliction haunting many Bramwell men. He died in 1931, alone in a barn surrounded by silence heavier than stone. Samuel carried on briefly, but even his iron belief could not save him. His mind fractured under weight of grief, his body weakened by inherited flaws. By 1933, he too joined the hillside graves. The compound stood empty. Cabins collapsed, roofs sagged, and ledgers rotted in damp corners. Where laughter might have lived, only echoes remained. The hills swallowed the silence, leaving nothing but shadows and ruined timber. Outsiders purchased the land through unpaid taxes. They found remnants of a dynasty, identical gravestones, records scrawled in brittle ink, and photographs of brothers standing together, their eyes vacant, their fates already sealed. Historians tried to bury the tale, dismissing Bramwells as victims of isolation, but the records spoke otherwise. This was not accident, it was deliberate. A bloodline consumed by obsession led willingly into ruin. Doctors later studied the notes, teaching students about genetic collapse. They called it a case study in concentrated bloodlines. Yet, beyond science, the true story was of sons sacrificed, brothers reduced to experiments. Every grave carried the same surname, etched repeatedly. Each stone stood like a warning carved into the mountainside. Together, they testified to what happens when loyalty to tradition outweighs compassion for brothers and sons. The photograph of Thomas and Samuel endured as symbol. Two grooms, brothers bound by decree, captured forever. Outsiders saw merely a wedding. Insiders knew it marked the peak of a dynasty's self-destruction. In nearby towns, whispers persisted. Hunters spoke of cursed ground, farmers avoided old paths, and elders warned sons never to bind blood too tightly. The Bramwell name became legend, etched into local folklore. Thomas's quiet defiance, refusing more sons, became final act of rebellion. Though too late to save his children, it planted a seed, reminding men beyond the hills that cycles can be broken. The ruins decayed, yet lessons remained. Generations later, descendants of neighbors recounted the story as caution. Purity without compassion leads only to graves, tradition without mercy becomes poison, and silence kills louder than screams. No brother from the Bramwell line survived to carry the name forward. Their bloodline ended in whispers, not wars. Their dynasty collapsed not by enemies, but by loyalty, twisted into chains across generations. Some scholars argued Morai believed he was creating greatness, but history judged otherwise. His ledgers recorded not progress, but funerals. His theories bred not strength, but weakness. His legacy was not triumph, but ash. Those who walk the abandoned hills today see only ruins, weathered stones, and names repeating endlessly. But beneath every step lies a story of men who surrendered freedom to tradition until nothing remained. The true curse of the Bramwells was not deformity or disease. It was obedience. Fathers obeyed grandfathers, sons obeyed fathers, brothers obeyed brothers. Each chose silence until silence itself became their tombstone. The story endures as warning. No creed, no tradition, no patriarch's command should outweigh the lives of sons. The Bramwell compound may be gone, but its ashes whisper, break the chains or be buried by them. In the end, such stories remind us that when families cross the natural limits of relationships, it leads only to pain, suffering, and broken generations. Every human being is honored with dignity, and protecting that dignity means respecting the boundaries set for us. From this we learn. When we protect family ties in the right way, society stays healthy, pure, and strong. Let us take this as a reminder, not to repeat the mistakes of the past, but to walk with wisdom and care for the future.